Hello, this is TJR, and this video is brought to you by my patron supporters. If you would like to show your support for these kinds of videos, please go to patreon.com/TJR, the original, and make a pledge. Patron supporters receive early access to select videos and also receive exclusive videos available nowhere else. And if you can't become a patron supporter, I understand. You can help this channel grow by just clicking like and letting this video play till the very end so that the YouTube algorithm recognizes me and recommends these videos to more viewers like you. Also click subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss a video. Thank you for your support. A Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd was released in September 1987. Unlike the last 5 Pink Floyd albums, A Momentary Lapse of Reason was not a concept album, and it was also the first to include contributions from outside writers. I remember when the album's first single, entitled Learning to Fly, hit radio. It was definitely a good lead-off single, and most fans, including myself, felt that it boded well for the album. After the album's release, I can remember that fan reaction was very positive. All of my friends who were into Pink Floyd also felt very good about it. For many, A Momentary Lapse of Reason felt like a much-needed return to form, especially after the very dismal 1983 album, The Final Cut. At the time, I do remember that I enjoyed the album, but right from the first listen, there was just something about it that bugged me. Something that was subconscious at first, something that I would initially ignore whenever it popped into my head, but eventually it would become more evident with each repeated listen of the album. Because you see, the more I listened to A Momentary Lapse of Reason, the more it felt like I was being tricked, and not in a subtle way, into thinking I was listening to a Pink Floyd album versus actually listening to one.
Say what?
But let's back up a bit. A Momentary Lapse of Reason was the first Pink Floyd album recorded without founding member and bassist Roger Waters. It's no secret that Roger Waters was the conceptual mind behind Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall. This has been well documented, and no one disputes this. The albums I've just mentioned are not only considered to be the best albums of the band's career, but some of the best albums of the classic rock era. Now, prior to the release of A Momentary Lapse of Reason, both Roger Waters and David Gilmour released solo albums. Gilmour with his second, entitled About Face, in March of 1984, and Waters with his first, entitled The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, in April 1984. Both solo projects attracted fewer fans, and David Gilmour would be forced to cancel shows due to poor ticket sales. This no doubt weighed heavily on his mind, and I think it's safe to say it was a strong indication as to why, in 1985, he began to consider and discuss the possibility of continuing the Pink Floyd name with drummer Nick Mason. Later that year, Roger Waters would announce his departure from Pink Floyd. There existed briefly the threat of a lawsuit from CBS Records and what remained of Pink Floyd to compel him to rejoin the band and help write and produce the next Pink Floyd album, but Waters did not return. David Gilmour reportedly told Roger Waters that they would continue without him as Pink Floyd, which resulted in a legal battle between Roger Waters and the rest of the band regarding the use of the name. Roger Waters maintained that without his involvement, the other 2 remaining members of the band had no right to use the name Pink Floyd. This would be a battle Roger Waters would eventually lose. Now, somewhere during all of this, David Gilmour, who was still unsure if he was working on a 3rd solo album or the next Pink Floyd album, recruited producer Bob Ezrin, who had produced The Wall, to help flesh out the material he was working on. It's worth noting that Bob Ezrin was originally invited by Roger Waters to work on his next solo album that would be eventually entitled Radio Chaos. With albums like Welcome to My Nightmare and The Wall under his belt, Bob Ezrin had a good track record for producing conceptual albums, something that Roger Waters also excelled at. But he chose to go with Gilmour, saying it was far easier for Dave and I to do our version of a Floyd record. I do have to wonder what might have happened if Bob Ezrin had chosen to work with Waters and helped him craft Radio Chaos instead of A Momentary Lapse of Reason. I'm guessing that Roger Waters probably already had a fair amount of his conceptual ideas in place for Radio Chaos during this time, versus David Gilmour, who once described his initial meetings with Bob Ezrin as mucking about with a lot of demos. Based on that statement, I have to guess that Roger Waters was probably not an easy person to work with at the time. And again, all throughout this process, I want to stress that David Gilmour himself was not sure if what he was working on was going to be his third solo album or a Pink Floyd project. That is until late November, though, when Gilmour and Ezrin took a meeting with the CBS Records representative to show what they had so far. They were told that what they had sounded nothing like Pink Floyd. By the end of the year, Gilmour made the decision to make the material he and Ezrin had been working on so far into a Pink Floyd album, and even agreed to rework the material that CBS found objectionable so that it sounded more like Pink Floyd. During the recording process, keyboardist and founding member Richard Wright, who had resigned from the band during the recording of 1979's The Wall, reportedly because of pressure from Roger Waters, was then recruited to play on the album. And while Richard Wright would be credited on the album, he was not credited as a band member, nor was he pictured as such, but was one of many keyboardists who played on the album. This was due to legal reasons that I won't delve into here. Reportedly, Richard Wright's contributions used on the album were minimal, but in an interview, Gilmour stated that having Wright's name on the album would make us stronger legally and musically, implying that having his name in the credits gave the album more legitimacy as a Pink Floyd album to both fans and the album's potential critics, and perhaps also to help build their own legal defense. And this is why within the album's artwork, David Gilmour and Nick Mason are the only two individuals pictured as official band members. Of course, later it would be revealed that during the preceding years since the last Floyd release, Nick Mason had grown unsure of his abilities as a musician and therefore didn't play a whole lot of drums on the actual album. Other drummers and other musicians were of course recruited to work on the album. One of Nick Mason's major contributions to the album, though, was creating sound effects for it. And I will circle back to that aspect of the album's production later. After the album's initial release and its mostly positive reception, Roger Waters would describe A Momentary Lapse of Reason as facile, which is another way to call something superficial, and in interviews describing the album as a clever forgery. Now, at first you might want to dismiss these remarks as sour grapes, especially in light of losing his legal battle with the other band members over the band's name. But honestly, I think he has a real point with this statement. Sometimes, when a band has a major change of personnel, it can result in a very different sounding version of the band. And this new sound is a result of how the various players in the band gel and collaborate on the songwriting and arranging process as a unit. But I don't believe this happened with A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Based on everything I have read regarding the production of this album, and given the minimal contributions from the other two remaining members of the band, Nick Mason and Richard Wright, will always make me feel suspect that David Gilmour, Bob Ezrin, and CBS Records set out to deliberately craft an album designed to push what I will refer to as listener nostalgia buttons, all designed to make you feel as if you are hearing a Pink Floyd album versus an album where the musicians involved in its creation steer how it will sound. Now, back in 1987, when I first heard the album, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, the term fan service was not one that I was familiar with. But I feel this album was definitely practicing a form of audio fan service in an effort to win listeners over. What is fan service? Fan service is a term that originally began with Japanese manga and anime. In its original definition, fan service is the act of adding something with no direct relevance to the story or character development into an anime or manga for the purpose of pleasing fans or giving them what they want. And initially, this type of fan service, as it applied to anime and manga, was generally sexually titillating in nature, giving the fans, mostly boys, what they wanted. But over the years, its definition has been broadened, especially when used to critiquing popular movie franchises like Star Wars, Harry Potter, The Fast and Furious, the Jurassic Park series, and the MCU. Fan service can be good, and fan service can be bad, and sometimes referred to as pandering fan service. An example of this would be the appearance of Evazan and Ponda Baba, sorry if I mispronounced those, in the Star Wars movie Rogue One.
Say what?
Who am I talking about? Well, these are the two guys who gave Luke Skywalker a hard time in the cantina in the original film from 1977. They bump into our heroes in the 2016 film Rogue One, and they come close to having a similar altercation. It's a fun little moment, but this cameo has no direct relevance to the story. It's considered pandering service because it serves no real purpose to move the story forward. It's just the movie winking at you saying, hey, remember these two guys from the first movie? Well, here they are again. Isn't that cool? Now please like our movie. And throughout the runtime of A Momentary Lapse in Reason, I kept spotting and recognizing these little audio callouts to previous Pink Floyd albums that felt to me like they were basically pandering to fan nostalgia, or the musical equivalent of fan servicing. For instance, at the beginning of One Slip, we hear some electronic machine noises that sound like a hybrid of both the electronic machine noises used on the title track of Welcome to the Machine and the alarm sound effects heard on the beginning of Time from Dark Side of the Moon. Now, these sound effects had a thematic reason for being on Welcome to the Machine and Dark Side of the Moon. But on One Slip, I really can't perceive any thematic reason for them to be there, other than to hit that nostalgia button and remind you of Welcome to the Machine. Throughout A Momentary Lapse of Reason, there are these unintelligible ghost voices. You'll hear them on Learning to Fly and on other tracks on the album. Now, Pink Floyd would oftentimes use these little murmuring voices in the background of tracks from, say, Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. But those voices, and more importantly, what they were actually saying, tied into the album's themes and narrative. Whereas on A Momentary Lapse of Reason, these murmuring voice effects just seem to be there to remind you of previous and better Pink Floyd albums. The opening pulse on Dogs of War feels very much like not only the musical opening pulse from Empty Spaces from The Wall, but also the audio tremors used in Welcome to the Machine. David Gilmour's vocal delivery also feels heavily inspired by Welcome to the Machine as well. And when this track breaks into the sax solo, it feels very much like a call-out to the sax solo from Money from Dark Side of the Moon. Signs of Life, which opens A Momentary Lapse of Reason, is a fine instrumental. But too often, it feels to me like abbreviated moments taken from the instrumental sections from Wish You Were Here's Shine On You Crazy Diamond. Getting back to the track One Slip, the main arpeggiated guitar riff is too reminiscent of a very similar riff used in Run Like Hell from The Wall. The bass and drum breakdown at the 2 minute and 45 second mark feels very reminiscent of the breakdown section in Run Like Hell also. Now, I realize that this album features 3 members of the original band, and that all bands sometimes recycle certain musical tropes. So it's expected that there will be sonic echoes from previous Floyd projects present in the album, and especially from David Gilmour, since he was part of what made those albums what they were. But for me, A Momentary Lapse of Reason feels too deliberate, too intentionally like it's trying to sound like past Pink Floyd albums. And when I take into consideration the minimal involvement from Nick Mason and Richard Wright, I can't help but feel that A Momentary Lapse of Reason sounds like a David Gilmour solo album, dressed up as a Pink Floyd album. Now, I may argue with the strategy taken when this album was in production, but I can't argue with the commercial success that that strategy achieved. Commercially, it worked. Now, in spite of what I've just said, I do also want to add that I still enjoy the album for the most part. Maybe not as much as any of their previous output, but enough to keep it in my collection. There are a few really great songs on it, like On the Turning Away, and also Yet Another Movie, that I think are really good. Now, by way of comparison, the follow-up album, Division Bell, had the 3 remaining members, David Gilmour, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright, collaborating together, with Gilmour and Wright writing the majority of the album, and lyrics co-written by Gilmour's fiancée, novelist Polly Sampson. Whether you like it or not, you can't deny the fact that Division Bell doesn't sound like any previous version of Pink Floyd, and it doesn't feel like it's trying to. It feels like a different version of Pink Floyd, one without Roger Waters. It doesn't feel like the album had a strategy to hit your nostalgia buttons and make you recall earlier Pink Floyd albums. Instead, it feels like its strategy was to have the 3 remaining members of the band create new music together. And I do wish that they had taken this approach when they began A Momentary Lapse of Reason. A remixed and updated version of A Momentary Lapse of Reason was recently released as part of the 2019 Later Years box set. It has recently been made available as a solo release. Now, I want to read from the press release. By returning to some of Richard Wright's original keyboard parts and by re-recording new drum tracks with Nick Mason, producers David Gilmour and Bob Ezrin have restored the creative balance between the 3 Pink Floyd members. My takeaway from this sentence is that this remixing and updating is an attempt to make the album feel more like a Pink Floyd album and less like it's trying to sound like a Pink Floyd album. I also get the feeling that there might be some attempt to remove a lot of the 80s style production as well. I have picked up the recent re-release, but I have put off listening to it till finishing this video, as I didn't want it to influence me. Now that this video is done, I intend to listen to it and see what I think. So stay tuned, as I might be doing a follow-up video very soon. This is TJR, and those are my thoughts. But let me know what you think. Do you think I'm onto something, or do you think I'm just on something? I'll be curious to hear what you have to say in the comments. Thank you very much for making it to the end of the video, and please share this video with anyone else you think might be interested in seeing it. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all stay safe and healthy. Take care.